Okay, the next section we're going to talk about here is signal routing. The basics of how to set up signal going in and out of, in this case, a Pro Tools system. For recording, for starters at least, I'm going to start with a guitar that we have over here. The guitar is plugged into the preamplifier, and then that's going into the input on the back of our Pro Tools system. So let's get into Pro Tools and show you how signal goes through this mixer and also through my outboard gear here, like my studio comm, out to my monitors. So before we start recording, in this case into a digital audio workstation, and today we're using Pro Tools, let's talk generally how signal flows in a recording situation. 99% of the time you'll be starting with some sort of source like your vocals, a guitar, a bass, drums, synthesizers. It might be a turntable as well, something like that. And you're going to have microphone or line level instrument coming into a preamplifier. In some cases, you don't have to use a preamplifier. Some synthesizers, turntables, things like that are already at line level and they put out enough signal to go right to your recorder. But a lot of times you do have to use a preamp. Now the preamplifier that we described in the previous section is going to take that signal and bring it up to what's called line level. And then at this point, once the signal is at line level, sometimes people will run through some sort of processing before they go to their recorder. Now this is an optional step. Some people, especially when recording like vocals, will like to use a compressor or a limiter. Often older school engineers will apply some equalization to the signal before it's recorded. With digital audio workstations, you really don't need to do this as much as you used to. So often people will go directly from the preamplifier right into their recorder. Now, currently, most people are using digital audio workstations as their recording device and their mixing device. But if you're old school, you might be using a tape machine like a 24-track tape machine or an 8-track tape machine. Now, from your recorder, you're actually going to go out of the recorder into your mixer. And your mixer, once again, could be a digital audio workstation or a mixing console. And from there, you're going to be monitoring or listening to what you're recording and tracks that were previously recorded through a pair of speakers or headphones, or sometimes both. Sometimes both in the case of if you're recording someone, you might be listening on speakers and they're in a studio listening on headphones. Also out of the mixer, generally that's where you're going to generate your final product like your CDs or your MP3s. So what we're looking at here is Pro Tools on a Macintosh computer, and this is OS 9. It's an older version. You can see up here is the Multi-Finder, which is an OS 9 feature. OS 10 has the dock, which is usually at the bottom of the screen. But Pro Tools is already launched, and the first thing we're going to do is create a brand new session. And in OS 9 or OS 10, you go under the File menu, pull down to New Session. So you might, as a musician, call this a song, but in Pro Tools lingo, it is a session. Now this is where a lot of people go wrong right off the bat. They put their songs and sessions all over the place and make a big mess of what they're doing. So you could see on this particular computer, we have the internal hard drive. It's not a good idea to record to your internal hard drive because recording digital audio beats up a drive. In my case, what I did was installed a second drive. It's an 80 gig ATA drive, and I broke it up into 4 partitions. So this particular song, I'm going to put on partition 3. And you can see I've got another song idea already on this partition. And I'm going to call this particular session Signal, if I could spell there, Signal Routing. And the file type, I'm going to use .wav type of files. This is more and more becoming a standard in the industry. You can use AIFF or Sound Designer 2 if you want, but for now we're going to use .wav files. Sample rate wise, we're going to work today at 48K because we're doing video. And for video production and post-production, 48K is more of the standard. If you're doing music production, you might want to use 44.1. CDs are pressed at 44.1. Or if you're doing higher res audio recording, you can use 88.2 or even 176.4. Both 176.4 and 88.2 divide down into 44.1 well when you're going to make a CD. But for today, we're going to use 44.1 and we're going to be working at 24-bit. And so now we have our name and we'll hit save. All of our settings are set up. And this is a blank Pro Tools session. This is what it looks like when you create a new session. So the first thing we need to do here is create a new track. And we're going to create one new mono audio track. Now you could create mono tracks, or if you're recording a keyboard or something like that, you might want to create stereo. But we're just going to record a guitar here, as I said earlier. And we're going to create an audio track, though I will talk more about the other track types in a little bit. So we'll hit create, and we have a new track. Now the first thing you should do with your tracks to keep things well organized is name your tracks. So in this case, you double click on the name. Here's the naming dialog for a given track. And we'll call this guitar, because that's what we're going to be recording here. And we hit OK. The next thing you need to do is select your input. This is the input selection on a given track. We are dealing with a 192 I/O interface, which has 16 inputs. So I'm going to select input 3 because that's where my guitar is routed. Now you could see that the name of this track is already guitar, and that is like that because I normally plug guitar through a preamp. Okay, we're going out of the guitar into the preamp into input 3, and we could set up that name like I had set up there in this window called the I/O setup window. Now this particular window, if we look at the input tab, you could see inputs 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. We go here to where the individual names are for input 3 and 4, and you could see that I've already named this input guitar. So input 3 is now guitar. Now if you want to name, for instance, if you always plug the bass through a preamp into input 4, you could name that bass as well. So we hit OK. And once again, those names are represented here. You can see I just changed input 4 to be called bass. There it is. So we have guitar going into input 3 via a preamp. And we're going to outputs 1 and 2. And the reason we're going to outputs 1 and 2 is because 99% of the time with a Pro Tools system, or most digital audio workstations actually, you'll use outputs 1 and 2 as your left-right outputs. So if we put this track in record ready, we should be able to hear the guitar. There's dry guitar. And usually when I'm recording guitar, I like to use plugins because it's really easy to use and you don't have to mic up an amplifier and crank it up to 10 and make a bunch of noise. It's a little easier on the ears. One of my favorite plugins for this is Amp Farm by Line 6. So we're going to choose the JCM 800. We're going to go with a 412 cabinet, and we're going to turn these settings here to where it sounds like a real guitar. Okay, so we've got the guitar with some processing on it ready to record. Now the cool thing about these plugins, for instance in this case Amp Farm, or if you want to use an EQ as well, for instance I could just go to maybe the simple DigiDesign EQ. So now we have an EQ on this track as well, is that these plugins come after the hard drive in the recording chain. So the signal is going to the hard drive, being recorded, then being fed through the mixer. So if I'm using this particular guitar setting for recording and later on when I'm mixing I don't like it, I could change it, and what's printed to the hard drive doesn't have this effect printed on it. That's a really cool thing about recording with a digital audio workstation as well. So another thing you might want to do is set up a reverb. So when you're recording the guitar, you have a little bit of reverb on it. So we'll go once again to the new track dialog, and this time we're going to set up a stereo auxiliary return. And auxiliary returns are different than audio tracks in that they just feed audio through the mixing environment. This will make more sense as we work along here. So once again, you can see the track goes out, output 1 and 2. And the input for this track, I'm going to select bus 1 and 2 as the input. And then we're going to insert a reverb on this particular track, and I'm going to use DigiDesign's Deverb. Now to get our guitar via an auxiliary send to go over here and get some reverb on it, we're going to send from one of our send points down bus 1 and 2. And now when I turn this up, this fader here, this is an auxiliary send on the guitar track. It's being sent over to this auxiliary track right here. And as I said earlier, I should name these tracks. We'll name that verb. So now that that track is named, this audio is coming over here via the bus, and we hear the guitar with some reverb. Okay. Now, if you want overall control of the level in your mixing environment, you can also create another new track, and we'll create a stereo master fader. With a master fader, this controls the overall level of all of these tracks that we're listening to. So right now you're hearing the guitar at this level. If we turn this down, it's quieter. So now we have overall level. Now, for monitoring purposes, I'm going to be using an outboard box, my studio comm in this case, or you might use a Mackie mixer to control our listening level out in our studio, but I'll talk about that in just a minute. So the reason I ran the reverb like this, and this is very important because I see a lot of people insert reverbs directly on tracks that they want reverb on. Now the problem with doing that is that if you want reverb on a lot of different elements, you're going to use a lot of reverbs and it's going to take a lot of your DSP processing resources up. Most pros bus to their reverbs. In fact, almost all the time they do. And that's because if I create another track, like let's say for instance we create a new mono audio track and we name this track, let's say we're going to record a bass next, and I want a little reverb on my bass, I can use one of my send points in Pro Tools to go to that same reverb. So we could use that reverb for the guitar and the bass, and if we create 20 more tracks, all of those tracks can send to the same reverb. The purpose of a reverb generally is to make audio tracks sound a little bit bigger, sound like they're in a natural room environment. That way, all of these tracks will sound like they're in the same room because we're using the same reverb. So this is a much more efficient way to bus your reverbs. So that's really the basics of how to set up your monitoring and your signal pathways. You set up a track, it goes to output 1 and 2. Now once this audio comes out output 1 and 2, where does it go from there? Okay, now we have Pro Tools set up and ready to go. The output of Pro Tools is coming analog into my box that I have here called a Studio Comm. The Studio Comm is a really cool box that has a single rack space unit I have set up in the back of my studio near my Pro Tools interfaces. The outputs of Pro Tools go into the Studio Comm. This is where I control my listening level, and then those outputs of the Studio Comm come up to my listening monitors up here. In this case, we're using some nice JBL monitors. Now, this particular box is a really kind of fancy way to do your monitoring, and also when it's time to use a microphone, I can turn down my studio monitors, turn up my headphones, and I'm ready to go. You don't want to have your monitors blaring in your studio with a live microphone generally, because you could cause feedback. So before I had my Studio Comm, I used to have a little Mackie mixer. I would take the two outputs, the left and right outputs from my mixer in Pro Tools, into the Mackie mixer, and then I would take the monitor outs up to my monitors here, and the Mackie mixer also had a really great headphone amplifier in it as well. So you could use a small mixing board instead of what I'm using here if you prefer. So let's move on to the next section. We're going to talk about setting up a click track. I'll show you a couple different ways to do that.